Welcome to God is Open. I'm your host, Christopher Fisher. Today we have on the line Dov Weiss. And Dov Weiss, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. I grew up in New York. My father is a Orthodox rabbi. My grandfather was an Orthodox rabbi. I was also an Orthodox rabbi earlier in life, and then I moved to academia. I did my PhD at the University of Chicago Divinity School, where I studied Jewish biblical interpretation and Jewish theology with Professor Michael Fishbane, a great scholar. And in 2011, I joined the religion department at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and I just completed my first book called Pious Irreverence about God and Rabbinic Judaism, published by Penn Press.
Excellent. And I've listened to you. You have a lecture out on SoundCloud about pious irreverence, and I must have listened to it maybe 5 times. Just a great lecture. And
Thank you.
yeah, so I suggest every listener go out and listen to that lecture, get a feel for what his book is, and then go buy his book. We'll let you plug the book a little bit later. But I'd like to really thank you for coming back on. We did this for the audience. For the audience might not know, but we did this audio recording already. But there were some technical glitches on my end. I just felt really bad. I'm like, oh no, I'm about, in the throes of depression, right? So you graced us. You came back on, and we're redoing this interview.
Sure, my great pleasure.
You are saving me. So thank you so much. So I found you.
I always love talking about God. So
I love it too.
Any time of day.
Excellent. So the reason I found your name, I was doing studies on Ephraim Orbach, Jewish scholarship, and just perceptions of Yahweh in Judaism, just the development. And your name came up. You were criticizing some of the things that Ephraim Orbach had written in his book, The Sages. And I found your literature. I found your academia.edu site. A lot of great articles on there as well. You pointed me to your most recent one, which talks about Jewish scholarship, the development of Jewish scholarship, and where we are at today. Also a great article. So,
Thank you.
In that tradition, can you just describe to us Yahweh as found in the Hebrew Bible? And I understand that there's going to be a diversity of viewpoints for these authors, but just like a general overview.
Yeah, I would say the key distinction, what's unique about the God Adonai, which is Jews tend to describe Yahweh as Adonai, so I'll use the term Adonai, that Adonai has a will that's outside of nature, as opposed to the gods of the ancient Near East that were associated with various natural forces, and there were times where the gods never even transcended the natural forces. In ancient Near East, the gods typically did not have all the power. There were battles between gods. Typically, there was a meta-divine power that was stronger than the gods. What you have in the Hebrew Bible is a God who is outside of nature and has a will that is transcendent. And God in the Hebrew Bible has immense power and immense knowledge. So in that sense, he's not bound by the typical biological constraints that human beings are. However, Adonai in the Hebrew Bible is a God who is emotionally vulnerable. So there's all this power and knowledge, but there's a deep vulnerability. And God gets easily jealous when the Israelites don't worship Adonai as they should. And he gets angry and he gets mad, and there are times when he wants to destroy the Israelite people, and Moses has to jump up and defend the people. So God really is a character. God is personality. God is unpredictable. God is history. Mm-hmm. And that's very different than the conceptions of God that we have beginning in the medieval period in the Jewish community.
Yeah, so I'm reminded of, Mount Sinai, of course, and God says, I'm just going to destroy all these people, and I don't care, I'll just make a new Israel through you, Moses. And Moses really has to argue him, talk him down, and give a variety of evidences, a variety of persuasion techniques in order to get God to subside his anger and go on
to back
Israel.
down. Yeah, to calm. Moses' function was to calm God down very often from his fits of anger, where he's just had enough with the people. And it's clear in the Bible that human beings, prophets, have an effect on God. I mean, typically we think of prophets as individuals who carry the divine word to the people. But what you see in Jeremiah, what you see in Habakkuk, is a conception of a prophet where a prophet does carry God's word to the people, but the prophet oftentimes as well defends the people and sometimes challenges God. And there are moments throughout the Hebrew Bible where God does concede some of these critiques, which is quite quite interesting and bold. And that's something that, of course, troubled many Jews and Christians throughout the ages. This conception of a God that's in certain ways human-like, both with regard to certain emotions as well as even body. I mean, there is no statement in the Hebrew Bible or in rabbinic literature, and when I say rabbinic literature, I'm referring to the Jewish writings after Jesus Christ, from, let's say, the year 100 to the Islamic conquest in the 7th century. There is no sense that God is incorporeal. That is something that begins really with Saadia Gaon, one of the great rabbis in the 9th century. So, yeah, I mean, that's really, when you look at the Bible and rabbinic literature, God very much is a character, a personality, someone who has immense power and immense knowledge, but someone who interacts, is involved in history, can change, is not static.
So God, as conceived by the writers of the Bible, was a person, a character, but these views started to shift over time. Can you talk about the development of the views in Judaism concerning Yahweh over time?
Sure. I mean, the major revolution was the medieval period, where you had two new movements in Judaism. You had Jewish philosophy, and the greatest of the Jewish philosophers, of course, is Moses Maimonides, who lives in the 12th century. He was born in southern Spain, Cordova, but spent most of his life in Egypt. He's writing in Arabic, Jewish letters, Hebrew letters, but in Arabic. And he's very much influenced by the writings of Aristotle, filtered through Arabic translations and Arabic commentaries on Aristotle. And the revolution is that Maimonides begins to think about God and conceive of God as not a character, but more a concept. The notion of a prime mover, the first cause, the unmoved mover. So God is no longer a he, a character. God is really a metaphysical concept. And Maimonides actually says that if you believe in the literal reading of the Hebrew Bible, that God gets angry or God has human-like limbs or human-like emotions, for Maimonides, that is the heart of idolatry. To make the claim that God is person, that God. So the Torah really becomes a dangerous document for Maimonides, because Maimonides believes that you have to read the Bible philosophically. And if you don't read it philosophically, you end up in heresy. And of course, Maimonides has to then deal with, well, if in fact the Torah is a dangerous document, then why did God write it in a way which appears so unphilosophical? And he has his explanations. The people weren't ready yet for philosophy, but so then that's on one hand, is you have a Maimonidean conception of God that's really an Aristotelian, an unchanged, immovable, transcendent God that has no real relationship with the world or humanity. Then you have another development, medieval Jewish mysticism, which begins in the 12th century in southern France really reaches its heyday in 13th century northern Spain with the writing of the Zohar, which is the greatest medieval Jewish mystical text of the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah conceives of God as a multiplicity of powers, a multiplicity of aeons. Some scholars have called it neo-Gnosticism or Jewish Gnosticism, because God also is no longer a personality or a character. God is a machine or a system of these powers that operate almost according to law-like necessity. So in both medieval Jewish philosophy and medieval Jewish mysticism, you have the fragmentation of the divine personality, or the depersonalization of God. Both the Jewish philosophers and Jewish mystics believed that you had to read the Torah not literally, but read it either allegorically, according to the Jewish philosophers, or symbolically, according to the Jewish mystics. And they both claimed, the mystics and the philosophers claimed, that they carried a secret tradition of how to read the Torah. And in effect, by claiming that they have the secret way of reading the Torah, they actually, I think, undermined, in a very powerful sense, the message of the Torah, because they're reading it through their own cultural, historical filter, whether it be, Jewish Neoplatonic Aristotelianism in the Maimonides case, or in Kabbalah through a mix of Neoplatonism and Neo-Gnosticism. I know I'm throwing around these big terms, but the bottom line is that you have a revolution in medieval Judaism, whereas God loses his character and his personality. He either becomes a complex system or a concept, a transcendent concept that one can never really fully grasp.
Yeah, I think that's pretty funny. There are claims that the Bible was written for this primitive understanding, but if you use primitive understanding to understand the Bible, you're in some sort of heresy. And it really becomes very subjective at that point. It's like, okay, so what standards do we use? Do we use your standards? Is your standards, are they biblical? Are they in the Bible? Or are they lined out there? Nothing. And it just becomes subjective. That's why you probably have this Kabbalistic school at the same time as, I don't know if I can say his name right.
Maimonides.
Maimonides.
Right.
All right, yeah. So, I looked at
the
name.
We know what? We could just call him Rabbi Moses.
Rabbi Moses.
My son's name is Moses. I like Rabbi Moses. Yeah, you have both the philosophers and the mystics really believe that no, the Torah must be more comprehensive and more systematic. It must be more engaged with the currents of the day, the ideologies of the day. So there's an attempt to harmonize, the culture and the religious sensibilities of the people around them, and to do so, they have to find a way to reconcile, their tradition, their culture, and their text, and they come up with completely imposing new readings onto the text that are not there.
So one thing,
but that's what often religious traditions do, is to often read back their own values and commitments back onto the text. It's just so blatant. It's just so obvious when you look at, in this case, when you compare the medieval reinterpretations to a simple, straightforward reading of the text.
Yeah, one thing you said that was interesting about the Kabbalistic school, I believe in your lecture, if not, it was the previous time we spoke, but the Kabbalistic school really had God dependent on the created world, and the created world gives him inputs, and there's this mutual symbiotic relationship, as opposed to the Neoplatonist tradition where God is totally independent of mankind.
Exactly. I think that's a real great point, which really differentiates the medieval Jewish philosophers and the medieval Jewish mystics, the Kabbalists, because the philosophers claim God doesn't change. God can never change. God is transcendent. That would somehow undermine the Greek philosophical view of God as perfection, unchanging and therefore perfect. Whereas the Kabbalists believe that God is affected by human actions. That if the Jewish people are committed to the Jewish traditions and Jewish laws, that harmonizes the divine structure. It unites the masculine and feminine aspects of God. That's something also that's very new in medieval Jewish mysticism, the idea that God has gendered parts. And that the goal is for these gendered parts, masculine and feminine, to unite as one, but that's dependent upon the human being. God needs humanity for God's wholeness. Mm-hmm. And that is something that's quite radical. You have certain of the, you have some statements pointing in this direction in the literature of the Talmud, in the literature of the Midrash of the rabbis. But there you do get the sense is that we're not operating with kind of like a divinity that operates according to predictable, machine-like, law-like necessity, but that God maintains his personality and character in the Talmudic literature. So yeah, we have an effect on God like one person can have an effect on another person, right? I convinced you to do something. Or in the Bible, Moses convinces God to do something. In Kabbalah, it's a lot more predictable, and it's more systematic and machine-like. So like if the Jewish people are doing good deeds and following God's laws, then automatically at that moment God is transformed. So there may be some commonalities between Bible and rabbinic conceptions of God and Kabbalistic conceptions, in that in all three the human being can have an effect on God, but the difference is whether it operates mechanistically or via an interpersonal relationship, as if one character is talking to another character. Whereas Maimonides and the whole philosophical tradition, Jewish philosophical tradition, they would think that's heresy, that somehow the human being can have any effect, on God.
All right. So how do you take earlier data points such as Josephus and Philo of Alexandria?
In terms of their conceptions? Well, Philo's an interesting case because Philo was a Jewish philosopher before Maimonides, about 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years before Maimonides. Philo of Alexandria is a Jew living in Alexandria. Look at that. His name is Philo of Alexandria, and he happens to live in Alexandria. And he is part of a school that's known as Middle Platonism, right? This is before Plotinus, who founded Neoplatonism. This is still Middle Platonism. And Philo's project was to synthesize the philosophy of Plato and the Greek conception of God, the Greek philosophical conception of God, with the writings of the Torah. So really you could say, hey, Dov, why are you pointing to Maimonides in the medieval Jewish philosophy? Why don't you go back all the way to Philo? And we could talk about how Philo conceives of God as an unchanging, perfect, transcendent God. But the thing is that Philo was never accepted by Jews, by the rabbis of the Talmud. As a matter of fact, Philo was preserved by early Christian community, by Origen, by Clement, and the first traditional Jew to quote Philo, believe it or not, the 16th century Italian Jewish Renaissance figure named Azaria de Rossi. Philo was rejected by the rabbis because the rabbis said no to Philo. The rabbis said, no, God is a character. God has personality. God can be convinced otherwise, and also Philo's writing in Greek, so there's a certain natural affinity to Christian, to Greek-speaking Christians, and of course Philo develops this idea of logos that becomes so important, obviously in the Gospel of John and in subsequent Christian, scholarship. With regard to Josephus was also a Jew living in the 1st century CE, but he doesn't really develop, strong conceptions of God. He discusses, of course, the differences between the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Essenes over questions of free will and predetermination. Apparently there was diversity within Second Temple Judaism over some key questions of whether there is an oral law, not just a written law, free will, predestination, and things of the sort. But he doesn't develop any consistent conception of God. Philo is really the first Jewish philosopher, but in a sense you can call him a Christian philosopher.
Yeah.
A Christian philosopher in the time of Jesus Christ.
Interestingly enough, Eusebius actually claims him as a secret Christian. So,
well, there you go. I'm not surprised. I didn't know that, but right. I am not surprised at all.
So, I believe in your lecture you talk about Jewish interaction with early proto-Orthodox and proto-Gnostics, the Marcions of the world. And can you talk about how Christianity influenced early Judaism in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at the Hebrew Bible, God is often challenged, as I mentioned, by figures in the Torah and in the prophets, of course, in Psalms and Job. And God seems to welcome and celebrate the dialogue, right? The arguments back and forth. And Marcion argued that Jesus in the New Testament is the true God, is the God of love, and is the true God, and the God of the Old Testament, Adonai, is an evil God. So Marcion was really, in some sense, a dualist. You know, there's a good God, the evil God, and he rejected the canonicity of the Old Testament, right? He didn't reject that it came from God, it just came from the wrong God. And the goal of Jesus and the New Testament was to correct all of the mistakes of the Old Testament. And to prove his point, Marcion goes through the Hebrew Bible and shows how the Old Testament God is an immoral God. And this is not just Marcion, this is other Gnostics as well, making the same arguments. You have pagans such as Celsus and Porphyry, who are also highlighting some of the moral problematic actions that were done by the Old Testament God. They also challenge, many of them, the true divinity of the Old Testament, because God doesn't seem to be omniscient. This is more the pagan critiques. And so what you have is the emerging Orthodox, the emerging proto-Orthodox Christians like Origen and Tertullian and Augustine and all the church fathers are trying to defend the unity of the two testaments and the divinity, the true divinity of the Old Testament by defending the morality of God. And in order to do so, they adopted certain strategies of reinterpretation, whether it be allegory and I think the rabbis were affected by this internal Christian debate over the morality of God, because you have something very, very new in 2nd century Judaism. There was a great rabbi by the name of Akiva, and he said that it is prohibited to ever challenge or criticize God. And the argument of Arthur Marmerstein that I cited in my book is that the rabbis were affected by this inner Christian debate, and the rabbis sided with the emerging orthodoxy, that God's morality had to be defended always in the Hebrew Bible. And to strengthen that claim, Rabbi Akiva and other rabbis said that it is prohibited for a Jew to ever criticize God, because that would imply, if you're allowed to criticize God, that would imply that there is a possibility that God made a mistake, that God did something that was immoral. So there's this new concept in early rabbinic Judaism that it is prohibited to challenge God. And I argue that this claim is very much affected by the battles being waged within Christianity. As we know, there were many rabbis who had conversations and communications with early Christian thinkers.
So I think this is a pretty good time to segue into a little bit about your book, Pious Irreverence, and just kind of tell us the basic themes and propositions that you're making in that
Sure.
book?
I mean, when I was a kid, I went to a very Orthodox elementary school, and whenever I asked questions about, why did God do this, or how could God have asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, or how can God have not allowed Moses to enter into the promised land? Look, he did so much for the Israelite people. I was always told that we were not allowed to ever question God's decisions. And but I continued to struggle throughout my life with certain actions that God does in the Hebrew Bible. And when I came to graduate school, I recognized that many of the rabbis struggled with my same questions. And instead of simply defending God, many of them did do that. As I just mentioned, Akiva and some of the early rabbis typically like to defend God's morality at all costs. But what I noticed in later rabbinic literature, the rabbinic literature of the 5th, 6th, and 7th century, was that many rabbis also struggled with certain actions that God committed in the Torah, in the Hebrew Bible, and instead of defending it or ignoring it, they often challenged God by putting critiques of into the mouths of biblical characters. In late rabbinic Judaism, there was a tendency to rewrite the biblical narrative. Right, so it's kind of like to see Moses and Abraham as rabbis of the 4th and 5th century. So what they did was, when they rewrote the Bible, they often put critiques of God into the mouths of biblical character. So, for example, when they re-narrated the story of Moses being denied entry into the Promised Land, instead of having the biblical account where Moses merely just, meekly supplicates God to let him into the land, the rabbis really give it to God. But they give it to God through the mouth of Moses. And my argument is that the rabbis were more open to the religious legitimacy of such an encounter with God. Although, of course, they didn't do so under their own shoulders. They put responsibility on the shoulders of the biblical characters. But that could also be because in the rabbinic period, the rabbis no longer believed that one could communicate with God. So if you want to have a dialogue with God, it's got to be an imagined dialogue between biblical characters and God. So in a certain sense, in the later rabbinic tradition, the rabbis revive the legitimacy of challenging God that we have in the Hebrew Bible. Look, Job gives it to God, very strongly. And God is okay with it. At the end of Job, God turns to Job and says, Job, you've spoken correctly. Your friends have not spoken correctly. Or, we mentioned before Moses, and we see it in Habakkuk and Jeremiah and many of the Psalms. So the book really deals with this question of trying to unpack the rabbinic debate. There are anti-protest rabbis and there are pro-protest rabbis. And I uncover the theological basis of both the anti-protest camp and the pro-protest camp. And then in the second half of the book, I look at the actual critiques that the rabbis level against God and some of the theological presuppositions and implications, being that there are many times in rabbinic literature, strikingly, where God concedes that he made a moral mistake. So I'll give you one amazing example, and that is, there's a 7th century Jewish text where they're rewriting the Ten Commandments. So God says in the Commandments that he's going to punish children for the sins of the parents, parental sin. And he communicates that to Moses. And then Moses turns to God in this midrash and says, God, how can you punish children for the sins of the parents? It's not fair. It's not right. What, you're going to punish Abraham because he had an awful father? Moses knew really where to get God. Giving an example of someone that God truly loves. So God unbelievably says in this text, you're right and I'm wrong. Lima ditani, you've taught me something. I will nullify my decree and accept your position. From now on, Now quoting Deuteronomy 24, children shall not be put to death for the sins of the parents, nor parents put to death for the sins of the children. A remarkable moment where God concedes that a phrase in the Ten Commandments may have been a mistaken position. It's a marvelous text, which I think really points to a radical conception of God. God is not only human-like in terms of having human emotions, but God can also make moral mistakes. And I think the message of many of these rabbis is very clear, and that is, there's nothing wrong with having a relationship with God where you're able to be fully yourself, where you can lay everything on the table. Because what does it mean to have a relationship with God? If you believe in a personal God, not everybody does, but if you believe in a personal God, what does it mean that you can't challenge or can't question? You're like what, a robot? You want to be a slave? You want to be in a real relationship. Lovers have to argue. Otherwise, they're not present fully in the relationship, you know? I argue with my closest friends, my closest members of my family. That means I'm engaged. That means I care. That means I love, right? And I think the rabbis, when they describe the relationship between God and the Jewish people, they often don't use the relational metaphor of master-slave. Because if it's master-slave, you know, if we view ourselves as slaves to God, then you're right. You know, we have no right to open up our mouths. But if it's friends, if it's lovers, right, that kind of opens up, you know, a real relationship, and I've found that it's helpful for many in the Jewish community to understand that it's okay to get mad, it's okay to get angry, or put it this way, there is legitimacy within the Jewish tradition to make such a move, and of course it becomes popular after the Holocaust in the writings of Elie Wiesel. There are two sides of the tradition, you know. Judaism has a openness to it. There are a lot of different points of view, but I think part of the agenda, which, you know, I'm an academic, so maybe I couldn't come out so forward and say it, but I think it was pretty clear from the book, is that I think there is a room within the tradition to have an honest, real critique of God. And I've even seen some Christian thinkers and scholars who have called upon the Christian community to be more open about the possibility of maintaining this sort of a relationship with God. Even though, of course, Paul says, you know, who are you to criticize God? You know, God is the potter and we're just clay. Who are you to challenge God? But
that's in reference to national election, not
okay.
Individual salvation.
All right, you know this better than I do.
but yeah,
I'm going to stick with citing Torah passages, Chris.
Sounds good. So yeah, Job is an excellent example. I love the book of Job. I love the Psalms as well. You see a lot of protest Psalms, people asking God, why is this the case? And they're suffering and they're dying. They say, turn your face to us. Why are you hiding your face? And it's a criticism of God for inaction. And a lot of people, they just want to say, oh, that's impious. You're
Exactly, and the question, of course, is that if it's impious, then why? How did it get into the Old Testament? You know, it seems to be not just any prayer. These are prayers of great figures. I mean, you know, much of Psalms is attributed to King David. So, so this is really a book. I think it's a book that was waiting to be written, because I think one of the distinctive characteristics of Judaism is this notion of a legitimacy of challenging God. It's not a unanimous view within Judaism, but there is a strong tradition. Of course, the tradition ends in the medieval period, because, as I noted, the Jewish philosophers and the medieval mystics don't have a conception of God as a character. So who are you arguing with? You're arguing with the first cause and an unmoved mover, a transcendent God who has nothing to do with the world. You're going to argue against the system of spheres, aeons in Kabbalah. That doesn't seem to make much sense. That's why it's distinctive to the rabbinic period, and also in the Hasidic period, in the 18th, 19th century, in modern Jewish pietism, it does reemerge.
That's interesting. So yeah, I owe you a book review. I'm going to buy your book. I'll review
your
book.
Thank you.
And maybe we'll have you back on to discuss your book. But
I'd be happy to. I mean, I think this is a fruitful conversation, between Judaism. There's so much in common between Judaism and Christianity. I mean, we share sacred scripture, and Jews and Christians are often faced with similar similar challenges in how to read the Old Testament.
So it's like if I'm not worshiping Yahweh, then I'm doing something wrong. So I should hope there's some similarities, right?
There is. I'm sure there is.
So before we get going, I had you on primarily to talk about Jewish scholarship and this tradition of views about Yahweh. Can you just tell us what's the current state of Jewish scholarship? How do they receive these ideas? What are their positions? What are the currents, basically?
Sure. I mean, when you think about the history of the Jewish God, I mean, there are really kind of 4 or 5 different conceptions. You know, the biblical / rabbinic, which we've talked about, the personality, the Maimonidean, which is the Aristotelian philosophical concept, the Kabbalistic, and then there's the Hasidic idea of Adonai. The Hasidic idea developed in the 18th, 19th century is really pantheism, that Adonai is within everything in the world, that everything is Adonai, if we had the correct vision. So, you know, the question is within the Jewish community today is which conception of God is the true conception? There are really divergent views, even with regard to the question of what is monotheism, right? Is the oneness of God just a number, that there's one God and not many gods? Well, Maimonides would say no, that monotheism isn't just a number, it's a quality, and that quality is that God cannot be divided, that God has no parts, and if God has no parts, then God has no body, right? So it's much more than just the number one. It's that God has no parts. In the Kabbalistic tradition, it's the other extreme. Monotheism means unity, the opposite, that God has parts. And oneness is the concept of bringing together all the various aspects of God. The Hasidic perspective in the 18th, 19th centuries is the radical claim that monotheism means monism, that everything is God. Mm-hmm. That if we had the proper eyeglasses, everything, this desk in front of me is pulsating with divinity. So what is idolatry? So idolatry for the Kabbalists would be, well, if you only worship this sphere of God or that sphere of God and not recognize the ultimate unity of all of the divine spheres. In Hasidic tradition, what is idolatry? Not worshiping other gods, but it's the belief that somehow the material world is distinct from God. That is idolatry, because you're rejecting the divinity of all materiality. So you know, and of course Maimonides will say, what is idolatry? Idolatry is if you believe that God can be divided. So if you believe that God has body, so my point is that the constant conceptions of God are constantly in flux. And the question is going to be in contemporary Judaism is which one of these descriptions of God is the correct one. So you have, for example, Michael Wishegrad. It's a great scholar. He wrote a book, Body of Faith. Get it. It's a phenomenal book. He says, I am going to side with the biblical and rabbinic conception of God. From medieval Judaism and on, hijacking of Judaism. It's all wrong. He's very anti-Maimonides. If you turn to Mordechai Kaplan, who was the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, he's going to say Maimonides is right. He's going to say God cannot be a character or personality. That's absurd. He's going to talk about God in philosophical terms, and he was a great 20th century thinker. If you look at the Kabbalah Center today, they're going to claim the Kabbalistic God is the correct conception of God. And if you look at another great rabbi who started a rabbinical school in Boston called Arthur Green, he's going to argue that it's the Hasidic perspective that has the correct view. So there are a lot of different contemporary rabbis running around kind of highlighting or emphasizing one conception over others. Of course, there are those that somehow want to synthesize. Mm-hmm. There are those Jews who want to see commonality within all of these different conceptions of God. That's not my approach. I think that when you try to reconcile and harmonize different views within the tradition, you end up with none of them. You end up with kind of different colors, and you end up with a big mishmash. But there are those within the religious Jewish world that are trying to synthesize the Maimonidean approach, the Kabbalistic approach, the Hasidic approach, the biblical approach. But I'm a scholar. I'm an academic. I like to see the historical evolution. I'm not an essentialist. I don't believe that there is one conception of God in Judaism. There are a lot of different conceptions, and I think Judaism is open. So open that it's open to seeing God in many different realms.
So where would you place Ephraim Orbach, and what is your criticism of his approach?
I mean, Ephraim Orbach, has a Maimonidean conception of God, which is his prerogative, and God bless him. I mean, he passed away. He was a great scholar at Hebrew University. He was an Orthodox Jew, received ordination at the Breslau Seminary. But I have no problems with him being a Maimonidean. The problem is that he imposes Maimonidean categories back onto the Talmud and rabbinic literature. So Orbach was the one who systematized all of rabbinic thought. Because as we all know, or maybe we don't all know, but we should all know, that if you read the Talmud, it's a mishmash. I mean, it's just kind of, there's no order. And Orbach made order, and not only did he make order, but he imposed abstract Maimonidean philosophical categories back onto rabbinic literature, right? So, for example, if it speaks about God having, anger, of course, it doesn't really mean that. It's just a metaphor. So he's very much affected by a Maimonidean reading of rabbinic literature. And Orbach, unfortunately, has been the trend for hundreds of years. It's only recently, with the writings of Michael Fishbane and Moshe Idel, what I would call the revisionism of the 1980s and 1990s, where these scholars said, no, you have to read the writings of the Talmud and Midrash on its own terms. Don't impose philosophical, abstract, Maimonidean readings of rabbinic literature. Read them on their own terms. This is myth, not the sense of not true, but in the sense of God is very much a character and a personality. So I'm very much in the this revisionist camp. I still think you have to be careful because it's not Kabbalah, and sometimes there's a tendency to shift from a Maimonidean reading, right, of the Bible and rabbinic literature, and shift to a Kabbalistic reading. I think there are more continuities between rabbinic literature and Kabbalah than there are between rabbinic literature and Jewish philosophy, but we have to still maintain the difference. But this is the problem with Orbach, and I think most people would agree that Orbach really imposes categories. He retrodrects, I call it, back onto the. But he was a great scholar. Don't get me wrong. Orbach is brilliant. People should read him, but recognize that he's trying to really kind of break down the differences between medieval Jewish philosophy and rabbinic literature.
Yeah. So. Yeah, I just saw his book, The Sages, went down to $10 on Kindle. So buy that if anyone doesn't have that already. Yeah,
I just want to give a warning. Well, not a warning, but if it's a fantastic, it's like encyclopedic work. So you're not going to sit, if you have insomnia, you can't fall asleep at night, that may be the book to read because it is a difficult book to go through. One of my exams, my oral exams for grad school, I got 5 hours in front of a computer and I had to write a critique of the book. I spent 6 months reading that book. So good luck to your readers.
Yeah. So one phrase that I like from your paper that criticizes Orbach's way of retrojecting, as you say he has those different containment strategies. I'm going to have to steal that phrasing from you and use it. So you have to contain the text. You have to say the text doesn't mean what it actually says, and you have to use these different methods to reinterpret it in light of what you want the text to mean.
Yeah, I mean, I probably heard that from my mentor, my teacher, Michael Fishbane. Yeah. But yeah, containment means you somehow have to push back against the text. You have to somehow say the text doesn't mean what it says, and there are a variety of ways to do that, to claim metaphor, to claim allegory, to claim or to claim that no, let's not take non-legal sections of the Talmud seriously. I mean, that was a typical approach beginning in the 9th century in Judaism, to say the writings of the rabbis, they weren't that serious. These were sermons. These were rabbinic sermons in the synagogue. They were just trying to keep the crowd awake during the Saturday morning synagogue. Don't take this stuff seriously as theology. These are just stories. The legal sections, That's important. So there are different ways to contain the problem, and Fishbane, I think, really does a marvelous job in the introduction of his book, Biblical Myth and Rabbinic Myth Making. The intro was phenomenal, where he goes through the various methods of containment. I also want to plug Moshe Halbertal. He's my favorite scholar of Jewish studies. Anything you see of Moshe Halbertal, I would just grab up. Starting with his book, People of the Book, all the way down to most recently his book on medieval Jewish esotericism. It's just phenomenal, and that is a really good writer, and I think is a really engaging thinker. I want to plug Moshe as well.
Excellent. So we're about running out of time. I'd like to thank you so much for coming on again to the podcast, giving us
my pleasure,
time.
Chris. If this didn't work out, I'm happy to come back again, because this is there's nothing more I love than talking about the history of Jewish theology, and it's been a real pleasure. And I want to bless you and your readers for all the good work that you're doing to try to uncover the truths of the world.
Thank you so much. So I suggest the audience go and buy Pious Irreverence. There we go. And thumbs up.
Thanks, Chris.
In the first podcast, I accidentally said irrelevance accidentally. So I don't know if you remember that, but I was like, oh, I hope that part goes away. And then it
did.
So,
my niece is a brilliant scholar at Brandeis, and she made that same move. So.
So
thank you so much, Chris. This has been a really great conversation, and I hope we can do it again sometime soon.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. Thank you.
All right. All the best. Bye-bye.